A couple of weeks ago, I sold my beloved GTX 1080 for the win hybrid because of reasons, and well, many reasons. And now with the GTX 1080 gone, I needed something to power my 1440p Korean monitor. I began looking through my collection of video cards to see what the next best thing was, and at the time Timmy Joe still had my 7970 GHz edition, so what was the next fastest card that I had? Well, I'm afraid that honor goes to the GTX 480. On a positive note, it's still pretty cold where I live, so I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone, right? Obviously, the GTX 480 is well known for its high temps and power consumption, but how well can it drive some semi-modern games at 1440p? Now, if you watch my GTX 480 video, you know how well it holds up at 1080p today, and if you haven't, then feel free to check that out above. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over the specs, but it's obvious the 1.5GB of VRAM is going to hold us back a bit at 1440p, so low textures are going to be a must. Now we're using my main computer today, so it's a bit stronger than my typical test system. It uses a 5820K overclocked to 4 GHz with 16GB of 3000 MHz DDR4. Now being that we don't have a lot of VRAM to work with, our system memory will be utilized quite a bit more. Now before we jump straight into the games I tested, I wanted to mention that I used MSI's Predator to record all of the gameplay footage at 1440p at 60 FPS. And because of that, CPU usage will be a bit higher, and performance shown is just slightly lower versus my benchmark run. Alright, let's jump into the first game we tested, and that first game is PUBG. Now we chose the very low settings with 100% resolution scale because gotta keep it real. Now we averaged 27 frames per second, which considering isn't half bad. In our 3-minute capture, we experienced quite a bit of jarring stutter parachuting off the plane, which is pretty typical. But while we were on the ground, frame times were not half bad. Now VRAM was completely saturated as we were tapping into our system memory quite a bit. Next up is a game that even your pops might play, Fortnite. And here we chose a low preset but kept the 3D resolution at epic. Now we averaged 59 frames per second in our 4-minute capture. It's not too shabby, right? The game felt reasonably smooth, but microstutter was present as shown in our frame time graph. Do notice on the left side of the graph the millisecond range isn't too large, so the stutter isn't quite as dramatic as it looks. Now, VRAM usage hovered in the 1.2GB range much of the time. Battlefield 1 is up, and here we tested the single player game using the low preset. Now we averaged 47 frames per second in our 2-minute capture, and frame time suffered a handful of 20 to 30 millisecond spikes, but the game still felt pretty smooth. Now VRAM was saturated, but I kept the GPU memory restriction option enabled, so it should help us out a little bit. Now overall, I certainly play the single player game no problem, but multiplayer, probably not. Now we move on to The Witcher 3, and here we maxed out Hairworks and, I'm kidding, we used the low preset. We averaged 28 frames per second in our nearly 3-minute capture. Now while frame rate was close to that 30 FPS mark, when scenes got hot and heavy, we saw FPS drop into the high teens. Now frame times were a bit messy, and we kind of expected it in this game, but towards the end of our capture they started to even out a little bit. Now VRAM hovered in the 1.3 to 1.4GB range most of the time. Alright, now let's jump into a game that's a bit easier to run, Overwatch. And here we chose the medium preset with 100% resolution scale because again, we're keeping it real, and we averaged 54 frames per second in our 3.5-minute capture. Now frame times were actually pretty good, with some micro stutter, but to me it really wasn't that noticeable. Now VRAM was close to being topped out, and I believe set some of the usage transferred over to our system memory as well. Now even with the medium preset, the game looked pretty good and was very playable. The next game is one that surprised me, GTA 5. Now I tried the game out using the normal settings at first, and I was surprised to see that FPS was in the 60 to 70 range much of the time. So for giggles, I ramped up everything to high with FXAA and some of that sweet 16XAF, and with these settings dialed in, we averaged 37 frames per second. Now in areas of heavy grass, we did see FPS tumble below 30, but in everyday driving, they were in the 30 range much of the time. Now frame times were surprisingly tight, with some evidence of microstutter, but man, you could lock this game at 30 FPS and just make some of the consoles look very bad by comparison. Rainbow Six Siege is up, and yet again we chose the low preset. And in our 2-minute capture, we averaged 40 frames per second, and frame times were excellent as they tend to be in this game, so no real issues to report here. Now, VRAM usage was only in the 1.2 gigabyte range, so nothing to report there as well. Overall, very good result. And the last game we tested today is Fallout 4. And yet again, we chose a low preset and averaged a surprising 50 frames per second. Now, unfortunately, average FPS never show the full story alone. Let me pull up the frame times to show you. Dear God, this game was micro-stutter city. Now, in this 60 FPS capture, the game doesn't look that choppy, and that's why it's important to show frame times, as average FPS and even video captures are not really good at telling our stutter story. Now, lack of VRAM seemed to be the main culprit here, as the GTX 480 had the power to produce decent frame rates. But it's also true this game engine isn't the best in the world either. Alright, well that wraps things up, and what did you all think of the GTX 480 at 1440p? Well, for me, honestly, I'm not that surprised by too many of the results, but GTA 5 was impressive. Of course, Fermi-based GPUs seem to excel in that game, so keep that in mind. Now, it's not just a VRAM issue that's holding us back in a lot of these games. It's obvious the card just doesn't have enough oomph to plow through some of these titles. Overall, it's certainly not a bad result for a card that lit the world on fire back in 2010. Anyway, this was a quick video that I wanted to throw together to share some of my curiosity with everybody, and thanks for taking the time to watch the video. But on another note, I'm by no means recommending that a 1440p gamer go out there and buy a GTX 480 during this current GPU apocalypse that we're all dealing with. But seriously, you should go buy one.